All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. This week, we are diving into the life and career of Jim Croce, so stay tuned. All right, but first, I do have another date coming up, so I will be playing at Gaslight Company in downtown Folsom on August 10th. That's an earlier show. That's 2 to 5 p.m. We're taking a little bit of a break for July here. We're going to be out of town for a while and stuff. So right now, the next date on the books is August 10th. So come on out and see me. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how excited I am for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, which is coming up August 22nd to 24th. So I'll be the MC this year, so I'll be there all weekend long, and I'm playing, it sounds like on Saturday. And last year was the first Kennedy Meadows Music Festival, and it was an absolute blast. We had Dave Stamey is going to be there again this year. We had Dallas Burrows last year. Dallas Burrows, that show was amazing last year, and he's coming again this year. Ben Haggard is headlining. Chad Bushnell is going to be there. It's going to be an absolute party, and I can't tell you how stoked I am. And now is the time to get your tickets. So if you've been thinking about doing it, now is the time. And I've got a promo code for you guys. The promo code is GeorgeCroftKM at checkout here to get your tickets for the Kennedy Meadows Music Festival. So come on out. They've got there's campsites available. There's RV campsites. There's tent campsites. I think the cabins are sold out right this second, but there's first come first serve camping in the campgrounds below in the Forest Service campgrounds. It's going to be an awesome weekend full of fun and just fantastic performances. So come on out, get your tickets while you can. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support, and that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my Linktree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one. And I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving. And we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out. And hopefully I'll see you soon. So Jim Croce is another one of these characters in music that we keep running into that had way more of an impact on American music than he would live to see fulfilled. He's one of my absolute favorite songwriters and performers of all time because he was so clean. His vocals, his words were always like, you could always understand what he was saying. He wasn't getting around some like stylistic thing where he's leaning on a vocal tone to blur some words. It was clear-cut songwriting poetry in front of just top-notch guitar playing. And some of that was because he teams up with a guy named Maury Muehlhausen, who's the kind of the finger picking sound behind Jim Croce that you hear in most of his records. But Jim himself was a top notch guitar player, and the two of them together just kind of put it through the roof. And so all of his songs you listen to, and it's just some of the best performing, songwriting, and singing that you can get your hands on. So Jim is born in 1943, and he's born in South Philadelphia. And his childhood's pretty, seems like a nice childhood. There's nothing crazy, nothing tragic like we've seen in some of these other stories. There's something in there about how he like pawned his brother's, I think it was a clarinet or a violin or something, to buy his first guitar. And that happened when he was like 5 or 10 or something. And anyway, or no, 15, he trades his brother's clarinet. That's what it was. Okay. So, but anyway, and he grows up listening to the radio, and kind of his musical inputs seem to have kind of run the gamut. He's doing everything: jazz, bluegrass, country, rock and roll, classical, like whatever. He did not have one kind of genre that he was locked into as a kid. And then, so he ends up in the late 50s. So in 1960 he graduates high school, and in 61 he goes to college at Villanova University. And it's interesting because Jim is the first person in his family to go to college and the first one to graduate. And he jokes about it later, that because he had a degree in English and like literature, and he says, all the things that you needed to survive the Renaissance, which, joking, like, he just came out of there reading Shakespeare for 4 years, and so he learned how to speak 400 years ago. But I kind of found that to be interesting, because he's another one of these guys who his songwriting really stands out. And the other guy that's like that was Chris Christopherson, who had a master's degree in English. And so it's, it doesn't seem to be wasted on either one of them. They both knew their way around the English language, and, were creative on top of that. So anyway, so he goes to Villanova. And in here, he's playing in bands, and he's trying to get work as a musician as he's in college. He's playing in, bars and stuff around Philadelphia. And this is where he meets what would become his wife, Ingrid. And so they met in 1963, I think. They meet because she was 16 at the time and he was 19. And they date while he's in college. And then so he graduates in 1965, and they get married in 1966. And their time together here, kind of leading up to and shortly after their marriage, is kind of a wild, it's just this young couple, and because she was a singer also, so, it's this young couple that kind of hits the music scene with this feeling of it's kind of us against the world, and it sort of was. So they're just playing any random, spot that they can get into, and money is really tight, and that's a trend throughout this whole story, is that despite being wildly talented initially, money was always tight for the Croces. And so they move out of the suburbs, out into the country in Pennsylvania, into this little like farmhouse that was cheap that they could afford. And it was close enough to the bars and stuff that Jim was playing in. And this is where you get just like a weird, that house was this universe kind of intersection point where like all these crazy stories come in. Because Jim is not famous at this point. You got to remember, this is like pre-success Jim Croce. Nobody except the local crowd really knows who he is. And what he would do is he would go to these bars and clubs and stuff, and he would always bring people back to the farmhouse for parties and stuff. Like, that was the after party was always at the Croce's house. And he had a habit of finding the most interesting people in the room to bring home. And he would bring home people on purpose that like clashed sometimes to like get a kind of diversity of people. His wife said that he would bring home, her exact quote was, he would bring home a preacher and a member of the KKK and just like talk to him in the living room and kind of see how the night went, kind of thing. And he was always trying to find people that kind of juxtapose each other like that. and they were bringing them home, and they would just come home and drink like homemade dandelion wine, which I didn't know was a thing until looking at this episode. And they would just, all of them, just sit around, drink, get high, relax, play music, and kind of, it became this like misfits club. And some of the other people that wound up in that house at this time was James Taylor, who would go on, obviously, one of these days we'll do a James Taylor episode, because he's one of my favorites of all time. So James Taylor's hanging out in Jim Croce's house. Bonnie Raitt, who I actually, a couple of years ago, I got to see James Taylor and Bonnie Raitt in concert together, which was great. So thinking about that now, I didn't know this at the time when I saw them together a few years ago. But like, James Taylor and Bonnie Raitt have apparently been friends since they were, I don't know, like late teens, early 20s, hanging out in Jim Croce's house. Arlo Guthrie, it was another one in there, and Randy Newman, who, I mean, You've Got a Friend in Me, Randy Newman. All these guys are just hanging out at Jim Croce's house long before he would be this household name. So it just kind of gives you the sense of the music scene at the time and how Jim was able to pick interesting people out and just kind of become friends with everybody and bring them all home, and they'd all sit around and play songs and have a good time. Ingrid tells a story just about talking about that, like drinking dandelion wine and hanging out. And then this kid is like, oh, I got this new song for you. And it's James Taylor playing what would go on to, be one of his classics. And they're just sitting around in the Croce house, just having a good time. And Jimmy Buffett was also in there. Like, he's one of those people that was hanging out. But anyway, so that's sort of the highlight of the Croce story for a while there, because during that whole time, like I said, money's really tight. And Jim makes a mistake, or a series of mistakes, that would kind of plague him for the rest of his life. So he gets he gets record deals, and he signs these contracts kind of without knowing what he's doing. He doesn't get anybody else to look at him. He's not business minded at all. He's a songwriter and a blue collar guy. And as long as the contract allowed him to write all the songs he wanted, that's all the fine print he needed to read. That was a mistake, because they were extremely predatory contracts that he got himself locked into. And it's kind of become like sort of the standard of what not to do. And like the reason you read the fine print today is so you don't end up like Jim Croce, because as his star starts to rise, him and his wife are constantly fighting about, like, how are we selling all these records and we're making the same amount of money we used to make playing college bars? Like, how is this possible? That, like, Jim's on the radio and they're flat broke. Like, Jim's selling his guitars to make money. He had like a little bit of a guitar collection going, and at one point, he's selling guitars off just to be able to pay rent. And he ends up, and he gets kind of demoralized, because at this point he knows anytime he's writing, he's just writing to keep the record label off his back, and then they're going to go on and make all this money and leave Jim in the dirt. And he knows that's coming. So like his motivation is slashed. So this is where he's working other odd jobs. So he's a signed artist, and he's still working odd jobs. Like, he's driving a semi truck. He's working as a DJ. He's doing anything he can get his hands on. Now, the upside of that is that's how Jim Croce writes some of his hits, is his ability to observe the world around him and just kind of see the beauty and the humanity in all these tiny little nooks and crannies, and then write these beautiful songs about it. That's where you get some of these songs. So like the Roller Derby Queen song, which is just like a hilarious, if you go back and look at it, like, first of all, the first thing you notice is Jim Croce's sense of humor. He was hilarious. And some of the things he would tie together and the details he would add in these stories, the guy was just a crack up. So, but he tells a story about being at this roller derby and kind of sitting at the bar. And he says that he saw this woman that he said if he didn't fall in love with, he fell in like with, that he was just like immediately zoned in on this lady. But she was like, a funny line that Jim Croce says that I will never say in polite company. This isn't me saying it. This is Jim Croce. But he says, if you're under 350 pounds, you're a person. And if you're more than 350 pounds, you're a place. And that's how he described this lady that he kind of zoned in on at the bar and got to talking to. And she had her hair all up and crazy. And so he's in there talking to her. And I guess he had seen her before. And so he's sitting there kind of making conversation. And her husband walks in, and he's the sheriff. And he walks in with his like kind of flat brim, sort of highway patrol type hat. And Jim Croce describes this guy as having the same haircut as a felt tip pen. So, just a high and tight, buzzed on the sides. This dude is like, and he's a giant dude. So Jim kind of feels threatened immediately. And he wants to write a song about this lady, but he knows this couple's going to hear it because he's playing in these bars and roller derby places all the time. He didn't want to make it like super obvious that it was about her, but so that's the roller derby queen song, is like, it's about this, it's just about that woman that he sat next to. And just in this weird moment of her husband walking in and him, just that whole dynamic, boom, captures it in a song that goes on to be, a classic. But it's just from this momentary interaction he has with this, person. Same thing for like Speedball Tucker, which I didn't realize. You listen to that song and it kind of has like a Smokey and the Bandit feel, where he's talking about just a truck driver with a broomstick on the throttle and kind of flying across. That song came from Jim's experience as a truck driver, because he did that often and long enough that he kind of understood the culture. And he's telling stories about like there's a line in the song about popping West Coast turnarounds. And when you listen to it, it's just like it's just kind of an upbeat, catchy line. I didn't know what that meant. Apparently a West Coast turnaround, and the reason the guy's name is Speedball Tucker is because the whole song is a commentary on how truck drivers in America at the time were all on speed, and they were all just juiced to the gills, driving back and forth across the country on drugs to keep them awake. And so a West Coast turnaround was a slang term for pills that would keep you awake long enough to drive from New York to California and back, and you would never have to sleep. Like, that's what, if you're going to pop a West Coast turnaround, that's what you were doing. You were taking pills, hitting the road, and just flying back and forth. And, but like I said, that's from Jim's time as a truck driver. And, so it's just like little, like, inside references like that I never would have caught, without, hearing Jim talk about it. And, anyway, so these songs are starting to kind of stack up. He's starting to get some, fame and success. But like I said, on the money end, he's still not seeing it. Like, even when he's at the peak of his fame, Jim Croce never experienced the breakout moment of, now I'm financially free. He never experienced that his entire life. That would come for his wife after he died. But he never experienced it. His experience the whole time was playing music as often as he could and just getting the shaft from record labels and promoters and stuff. And he would just keep on trucking. And, anyway, so later on here, so we're getting into the late 60s, and into the early 70s here. So in 1970 is when he meets Maury Muehlheisen, and that's where, if you go back and watch Jim Croce performances, it's him on the stage with a guy behind him playing guitar. That's Maury. And they became like best friends, and they're, together constantly. They gelled super well together. I read somewhere that they initially got together for Jim to play lead guitar for Maury, but then the roles kind of switched after a little bit. And that obviously works. I mean, when you see them, they're like two extensions of the same person playing these guitars, and it's just phenomenal. And, so here we are in 1970, late 1970, and him and Ingrid are under a lot of stress already. Like, they're, like I said, financially, they've never had a break here. And they got to, and she, they want a family. They're in their, late 20s. And so one day, I guess they had been trying for a while to get pregnant, because Ingrid goes to the doctor to like get checked out to see if she can even become pregnant, I guess that was the question she went to the doctor to find out, is, can I get pregnant? And the answer was, you're pregnant right now. And that's, so she comes home and she tells Jim, hey, I'm pregnant. And she said that in his face, you could just see a switch go off, and he suddenly his feeling of mortality and his sense of how much time he had left in the world really clicked, because suddenly he has a child to raise, and he seems to have taken that on as he was, I guess the way I said that, it made it sound like he was scared. He was excited about it, and he was like, he was thinking of his mortality in this kind of positive way. He wanted to make the most of his time to raise his son. And so his son is born, AJ, Adrian James, but everyone calls him AJ Croce, who's still out there making music to this day. But anyway, so AJ is born in 1971. And that gear change in Jim Croce's head is where you get the song Time in a Bottle. Because he goes inside, I think it might have been the same day that he found out she was pregnant. I think. He goes in the house, sits down at the piano, and writes Time in a Bottle. And if you listen to that song in that context, that it sounds like a love song to a woman, but when you realize it's a dad talking about time with his kids, that, especially if you know where the story's going, that is such a heartbreaking thing to know. Because, like I said, so he writes Time in a Bottle. It's a giant success, right? So that starts to give him a little bit of breathing room, but kind of the ironic effect of that song taking off is now Jim's gone all the time. That really drags him out on the road. I think Ingrid said at one point he was doing 300 shows a year for like that span of time. So he's just never home. And he's still not getting paid very much. So he's so big, giant, successful song about wanting to spend time with his kid has the reverse effect of just being gone all the time. And it's bothering Jim a lot. And it's bothering Ingrid a lot, and it's causing a lot of tension in their marriage. But they, they stick it out here. And and this is kind of in this spot. It's followed up quickly by like Operator and like a couple other ones that I think Bad Leroy Brown hits #1 on the Billboard chart. So like now people are starting to know who Jim Croce is. And this is where Ingrid's still saying, like, she's seeing Jim on TV. She's hearing his songs on the radio. She hasn't seen him in person for weeks or whatever, and they're still broke all the time. But she's just sees him in popular media constantly. And so they start to talk about, I think they moved to San Diego at one point during this time. Because she just wanted like a sense of normalcy. So and I don't exactly know how she landed on San Diego, but they moved to a neighborhood called like Normal Heights or Normal Valley or something. And she said she picked it just because it had the word normal in it. And that was like what she was after. And so here they are, Jim's, getting pulled super thin by the industry. But, like I said, and he's now, AJ is like getting to be like 1 or 2 years old. They're doing you can find a bunch of really sweet footage of like Jim playing with his son, and he's doing interviews, or like there's one interview where he you can hear AJ like screaming in the background in the house, and he's like, oh, AJ's trying to sing. And he like brings him outside just like, he's very clearly, when he's home, a super passionate and involved dad. Like he liked everything about, having a son around. And but so here we are in 1972, I guess. Jim and Ingrid are both just worn so thin that they know they have to make a change. And Jim starts talking about just walking away from the music industry because it's just not it's not paying the bills. It's not enough. It's spreading him way too thin. It's beating him up, and it's not worth it. And Jim starts talking about wanting to kind of quit music and just become a writer and maybe work on movies and screenplays and stuff, because he had name recognition now. Like, you have a little bit of freedom there, so he can go make money doing other stuff and get out from under these crazy music contracts that he was in. And he's saying it specifically because he feels, taken away from his family. He wants more time at home, and he wants more financial freedom. And as he starts talking about this, he writes a letter, like an open letter to his wife and his friends. And there's a couple of different, I couldn't find the full text of the letter to his wife, but he writes this letter, and like to his friends at least. And he's kind of, it's like he's prepping everybody for him to leave. Like he's prepping everyone for him to leave the music industry. But like I said, if you know what's coming, oh man. It says, "Dear friends, my cup got so full it overflowed, and I had to empty it to really learn about life and what it means to be me. I now want to be the oldest man in the world with a face full of wrinkles of wisdom and a lot of cross-the-board buddies. One thing I don't want to become is intense. It's the first 60 years that count, and I've got 30 to go. Be cool, Jim." So it's just a written account. This guy is like talking to his friends about, hey, he's 30 years old when he's writing this. So he says, the first 60 that count, I've got 30 to go. He wants to be the oldest man in the world. Like that's, and because he saw this picture of himself. He was sitting with his wife, and somehow they were going through pictures, I guess. And he sees this picture of him, which has become kind of this iconic picture of Jim Croce with a cigar in his mouth and his big mustache. And his reaction to that was like, I look so old. And his wife was like, yeah, dude, like time is cranking on us here. But then that's in his head. He's like, okay, like I've got to make the most of whatever's next here. So seeing that picture of himself while he is under all this pressure causes him to write this letter talking about how he wants to be the oldest man in the world. And this is right after, like I said, he wrote Time in a Bottle. So it's just reflection after reflection of his sense of mortality and his want to live a long time and be there for his kid at the time. And so he tells Ingrid, all right, I'm done. Like I'm out of the music business. I have one more tour to do, because there was something about one of the shows that he did. It might've been the last show he did. He had gotten sick before. It was a previously scheduled show that he just got sick and had to cancel the show, which he hated to do. And he didn't, I think that might've been one of the only times that ever happened to him. And it was like, basically the timeline went, Jim Croce was an unknown playing college campuses, made an agreement to do a show for like $700. Gets sick, has to cancel, but he told them he would make it up. In the span of time before Jim gets back to make that gig up, now Jim Croce's famous. Like he's a celebrity. Now he's not making very much money, but he's big enough that the college should not have been able to afford to bring him back. But he did it because he was just holding up. He felt bad for canceling the first time. So the people at this college are just stoked because they're getting Jim Croce, the star, for the same price as Jim Croce, the up-and-comer. So he goes back and does this show. And Ingrid remembers just having an uneasy feeling the whole time. She was having wild dreams about, like, she said the end of one of her dreams kept, like, it would be the last couple images in her head on repeat, almost like you hit the end of a record and that's it. It's just going to sit there and spin as long as you leave it turned on. And she said she woke up at 4:30 in the morning and it was her stepmom calling, or it was her. Yeah, I think it was her stepmom. And that person had been watching the TV and was calling. And I think the first thing she said to Ingrid was, "Hey, are you okay?" And Ingrid was like, "Yeah." And then her stepmom said, "There was a plane crash." And Ingrid immediately knew, and she goes, "And Jim's dead, isn't he?" And she said, "Yep." And she said, "And Maury?" She said, "Yep, everybody on the plane died." So basically what happened is they were leaving some town, and I think they were they're in Louisiana heading to Texas. And Jim had gotten it in his head for whatever reason. They were supposed to leave at a later time, but Jim got in his head that he wanted to leave early. Like, so it was early in the morning. And so he calls up the pilot. Now, this is where you get kind of an interesting little side story here. The pilot, whose name is not in front of me, I think he was like 55 years old at the time or something. Gets this call, "Oh, we got to get the plane ready to go for Jim and Maury and all the guys." And he has to get a taxi ride to the airport, Well, there's no taxis at that time, or there was too long of a wait for a taxi or whatever. For whatever reason, this guy who had already survived a heart attack once decides, all right, well, I guess I'm going to have to just walk to the airport. It was 3 miles from the hotel he was in. And so he starts walking. Well, then he gets turned around. He takes a wrong turn, ends up in the middle of a cornfield somewhere. So then he starts running. So he gets to the airport kind of late, but like close enough. And he's just like out of breath, sweating. Like this guy had like huffed it to get to the airport on time. But everybody said that he gets on the plane. He does all his pre-flight checks. Everything seemed fine. But, they go to take off. First of all, they took off downwind, which is not ideal and it's like a tiny little plane. It's like a Seabreeze something, or I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's like the plane could only fit those 5 guys or whatever. And they're taking off with the wind, which, like, I guess when you're flying planes, like, you want to take off into the wind so you achieve lift a little bit faster. They were taking off with the wind. And so, like, and what did I say before? You want to take off against the wind to achieve lift. With the wind is less ideal. That's the way they were going. And the plane leaves the ground, doesn't achieve lift fast enough, slams into a bunch of pecan trees at the end of the runway, and everybody dies instantly. And that was Jim Croce. That was Maury Muehlheisen. That was the pilot. There was a comedian was with them, and one of their like road managers. I think there were 5 people on the plane. Anyway, everybody dies. And here we are at another situation. It was just like Hank Williams' story, where after he died, like a month later. So all these artists that keep dying in our stories, they're dying while they're working. So like there's always something in production on, right behind them. So they die, then their next song comes out, and it's a gigantic hit, and it just slingshots them up into the stardom that they never experienced because, them being dead does help in the marketing of it all. And, like, everybody had just seen Jim Croce's name in the paper. He's this, tragic loss, and that got people looking into his stuff anyway, and now there's a song coming out, and that song was I've Got a Name, which blows up the charts, and it's like this great success. But like I said, Jim is just not around to see it happen. And like I said, and now you're in that context, go back and listen to Time in a Bottle and this letter, from him to his friends and stuff. And it's all just so tragic. And it's just like he had every intention of not only continuing, with his music, like he was going to keep writing songs, but he had every intention of like slowing down and being a family man. That was his plan after this tour that he was on. And it just didn't happen. And so then you get into the years, afterwards here. Ingrid initially is furious because, and rightfully so, I mean, she's mad at Jim for being gone. She's mad at like the music industry for forcing him to do that. She's mad, like she's mad at herself. She's mad, like she's just initially just the wave of anger comes over this lady. And like I said, rightfully so. And she proceeds, because she had tried to talk to Jim while he was alive. She kept trying to bring up, hey, we're kind of getting screwed over on the financial end here. Like, how are we not making any money when you've got gold records out? Like, how is this a thing? And anytime she brought it up, Jim didn't have a lot of room in his head for figuring that stuff out. Like I said, I mean, he signed these terrible contracts. I mean, that probably a short time reading them would have raised some red flags. That just wasn't his style. He just wasn't a business-minded guy. And so when his wife is asking him to crunch the numbers and figure out what the hell is going on here, it really bothered him. And they couldn't really talk about it. He would kind of shut off and kind of, like when he wrote the song, I'll Have to Say I Love You in a Song, he wrote that directly following a fight that they had over that topic. Like Ingrid's kind of cornering him, like, what are we doing here? Like, how come we're still broke? They have a little bit of a blow up. Jim goes to the next room and writes this beautiful and sweet song about just not being able to get the words right all the time. And anyway, that fight never gets resolved. Like the whole time, Ingrid is just furious about the situation they're in. Then Jim dies in service to that thing that's not serving them well. So once Jim dies, she is a dog with a bone, and she just goes after those companies for royalties and like back royalties and stuff to Jim's catalog. She initially, it sounds like she files a wrongful death lawsuit and wins initially. She won like $775,000 or something, but that later gets overturned by the state Supreme Court, which kind of made sense to me. I was like, I'm not sure who you're suing for wrongful death for a plane crash other than the pilot, who's also dead. So like, I'm not exactly sure who she was even suing for that. Like, was it the record label? But them leaving at that time was Jim's idea. So I was surprised to hear that she initially won that lawsuit. It was then turned over by the state Supreme Court. So she didn't get that lump of money, but she does succeed in getting like a $6 million check, which is like, I read somewhere that it's like the equivalent of $15 million today. But for when his catalog gets sold, it was like to Sony or some one of these other big conglomerates. So through several years and several different legal battles, Ingrid does finally get her, she gets to ride off into the sunset and be financially well off. But that's even with $6 million. I'm sure she would have rather, been poor with Jim Croce around. Like it's not like, oh, that makes everything better. But at least this lady does get, like, she doesn't have to live the rest of her life poor. She does get a nice send off at the end. But it's, yeah, like I said, it's, I'm sure nowhere near enough to make up for the hole that is left behind by this dude who is just a creative genius, a good dad, like a hardworking guy, just a poet. Like the guy's ability to observe the stuff around him, put it into words that make up great songs, he was just one of a kind. And his stuff is still so good. You can spend all day listening to Jim Croce's songs. Even now, they're so good. And like I said, and his son does go on to have his own music career, which he'd be an interesting guy to talk to for sure. But yeah, AJ Croce. But and he writes his own songs, does a lot of his own stuff. He's worked hard to have his own successes and his own, So he and I heard him, like I saw an interview with him talking about how like he does play Time in a Bottle, sometimes at shows, but like initially he couldn't even do it because in that it's sad to even just know that when you listen to that song now, and it's the context of a dad wanting to spend more time with his kids, knowing that dad is destined to never be able to do that. Now imagine being the kid the song was written about. That's AJ Croce. And so he had a really hard time performing that song initially. And even now, I'm sure it's a emotional roller coaster, but he says he has to kind of put it off in his head as just another piece of music. And he can't think too hard about what it is when he's playing it, because he'll just come apart, which I almost choke up just thinking about it. Like just the situation on his own is just so tragic, man. But anyway, like I said, we are left with the tragic story, but also just the top-notch music of Jim Croce. And I think Jim Croce is one of the best songwriters of all time. I think like my Mount Rushmore of songwriters is like, well, John Prine's probably near the top. Jim Croce is right there with him. And then it's like James Taylor. And like, which apparently, which I didn't even know until I was doing this story, that James Taylor was like sitting in Croce's house, so anyway, that whole string of dudes, they're all just unparalleled in skill and, talent and creativity. But yeah, Jim Croce was one of the best. So that's it for Jim Croce. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.